is the anglicized name for my people. This territory is shared territory between Squamish, Quematsuquam, and Tsleil-Waututh. Three distinct groups that have used this land for generations. Indigenous people of this land were known as Coast Salish, which is actually a term that was created by linguists, American linguists in the States. Salish is the name of the Flathead tribe in Oregon. Then they used that term to apply to all the groups that spoke a similar language, that had similar language groups. So there is no Coast Salish language. There's 14 Coast Salish languages. And there's also Interior Salish, Coast Salish. So there's actually 35 or 36 distinct Coast Salish nations, occupying, like Kat said, a large, vast territory. It occupies the largest territory for Indigenous people in the Northwest Coast. Historically, for my own people, we were estimated to be numbered around 60,000 people. So 60,000 of my ancestors occupied Burrard Inlet, False Creek, Vancouver, Indian Arm, Burrard Inlet, Howe Sound, Squamish, up the river, Squamish River, and up to Whistler. So that encompasses English Bay, all of that. It encompasses our traditional territory that we used to live within. And 60,000 people. Over the course of the last 200 years, beginning with waves of diseases plus colonization, contact, everything, my people were reduced down to about 380. From 60,000 to about 380. And now we're repopulating, regrowing ourselves back, and we're at 3,500 now. If we were to look at the territory and what it would have existed prior to contact, for the people that lived in this land, in unceded Coast Salish territory, unceded meaning that we haven't surrendered our land, we haven't given up our rights, we didn't say, okay, you guys being the Canadian government or the settler state, you guys have our land, that's it, we give up. That's not what happened. We are still here, we never surrendered it, so it's still our land, we never gave it up. Back in the 1800s, the church was actively setting up missionaries within our villages, actively seeking to convert the Indigenous people to Christianity. And around the same time, the government was trying to sort out what they were going to do with the remaining Indigenous population that they haven't either killed off or gotten rid of yet, or displaced yet. So there was kind of this partnership where they started working together to accomplish similar goals, putting the Indian population and Indigenous population into small communities that could be managed and controlled, which were created through the reserves, and then have them run by either the church, or in my people's case, there was a few villages run by the church, and then the church set up basically puppet leaders within the rest of our communities, who were, at the time, this is the late 1800s, the church would set up people that were obedient, Christian, and sober. And they were actively creating chiefs out of these people and giving titles to community members from my community. We had 16 villages, and naming them chiefs. This differed from our own society, from our own cultural practices, where within Northwest Coast, or from Pacific Northwest Coast culture and Indigenous communities, your places in society was determined by how much you gave of yourself. So both through cultural means and also through property and material wealth. So the people who gave away the most, blankets, food, tools, anything like property, the people who gave away the most, their status in the society went up. Completely opposite of obviously what we live today. Today it's if whoever has the most is the richest. Whoever accumulates the most amount of wealth in material things, they're the highest, considered the highest society, right? So it's a completely opposite structure, social status within how traditional Indigenous society from this territory was to what it is now. And so it became this process of basically dividing the people, controlling the people, and separating it into all this way of aiding in their ultimate goal, which is colonization. Their ultimate goal to get access to our lands for extraction, for resources. This area was fertile with resources, all the forestry industries and everything that was going on at the time. So they needed to get the indigenous people out of the way for that. My mother told me a story that her father told her about this Squamish man they were forcing them to leave. And there's a picture of it apparently somewhere, and my great-grandfather's seen it. And it's the man, there was like an elderly man who was refusing to leave the village. And there was an Indian agent and a priest. The priest was standing over this native guy, and he was refusing to leave. And the picture was of the Indian agent shooting him in the head. That was 1911. That was either you get out or we kill you. Colonization, in a nutshell, is really about change. It's really about how things have changed for my people and for all of our people, Indigenous people. How things have changed on social, political, and economic levels. So when I talk about decolonization, when we use that type term, or when I'm talking about that kind of work, I see decolonization, or the work, is to restore an Indigenous way of life. Because so much has changed for us, so much has been removed from our lives, so much has been taken away from us, that I see decolonization as a way to reclaim what has been taken away from us. So it's actively asking ourselves, how do we live a more Indigenous way of life as opposed to a more colonized way of life? Now there's the idea that over the past 20 years, this idea that colonization has ended, that we're living in a post-colonial world, and that we're entering this new age of relationship in politics for Indigenous people, and it's different. We're Aboriginals now, right? We're happy, employed, capitalist-seeking entrepreneurs who become doctors and lawyers and things like that. When the reality is that colonization is still going on. They're still trying to take our land. They're still trying to actively seek our resources. They actively still don't want us to question and to challenge and to dissent against those policies and those actions, because they would rather us be happy Aboriginals who participate in cultural ceremonies for the Olympics and opening ceremonies and all that kind of stuff. So within the history of Canada as a whole, Indigenous people have always been posed as the problem. There's this thing within Canadian politics and dealing with the relationships between First Nations and the government is the Indian problem. The Indian problem has been around within policy for the past 100 years since the Indian Act was created. The Indian problem. It's always been about the Indian problem. So from the government standpoint, it's always been framed as the Indian problem. And the Indian problem, from their standpoint, has always been about the Indigenous people failing to modernize, failing to become Canadians, failing to become like the modern society that Canadian society, Canadian society believes itself to be. But from an Indigenous perspective, our problem, our issue, the root of it, has always come down to two things. From our perspective, it's always been and always will be about land and justice. And there's nothing that can change that, except us forgetting that. Except for Indigenous people forgetting that. That's the only thing that will change that from being a reality, is when we forget. And so, like I said, everything comes back down to land and justice. So decolonization is confronting that colonialism, confronting those threats that are trying to change us still, plus reconnecting what has been taken from us in the past 150 years. So it's this two-level thing of trying to push back what's been already pushed on us and pushing back what is being currently pushed on us. And within that, we find a way to decolonize, we find a way to restore Indigenous way of life, and find a way to restore a lot of this connection that we used to have as Indigenous people, a lot of the things that make us Indigenous, and pushing back against becoming a more colonized person within this colonized country.